This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. New York has enshrined some ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets into legislation, aiming for 85% reductions in carbon emissions by 2050. One of the big tools that the state is planning on using to reach that target is something called Cap and Invest, a program that's currently being jointly designed by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, and the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. The Cap and Invest program aims, over time, to ratchet down the allowable amount of carbon coming from heavy emitters in the state. The program could have an extraordinary effect on all aspects of the economy in New York, so in order to learn more about the Cap and Invest program, I reached out to my friend Karsten Barde, Director of U.S. Policy and Regulatory Strategy at National Grid, one of the major gas and electric utilities in the state, and one of the big organizations that's going to be affected by this rule. What is Cap and Invest? Who is it likely to impact? And what can we expect as this rulemaking moves forward? 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race to hit Earth, or about the amount of time needed for Taylor Swift fans to download. Okay, hold on. Let's carry the one, add a few zeros, regret my life choices. Well, enough time for tens of thousands of downloads of the newest album. Let's get it on. Karsten, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you on, and frankly, to learn a little bit more about this Cap and Invest program that New York has offered up, and really, unpack what the ramifications and implications of this might be. But before we dive into that, how about a quick introduction as to yourself and your role at National Grid?
So I'm Karsten Barde, and I'm a director in the U.S. Policy and Regulatory Strategy team at National Grid. National Grid serves customers with electricity and gas service in Massachusetts and New York, parts of both states, service territories serving upstate and downstate, central Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts. And my team focuses on state policy issues affecting our energy customers and our energy businesses in order to try to achieve the balance that we need to strike between reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And I love what I do. I love analyzing these issues. I love talking to experts within our organization, operational experts, load forecasting experts, and so on, to come up with innovative policy solutions and help educate all of our stakeholders about the changing energy landscape here.
Well, innovative policy solutions being what they are in New York, you can't get any bigger than Cap and Invest and what this actually has as a meaning for the New York economy. How about give us a little bit of a framework? What is the Cap and Invest program in New York, and how is it being structured right now?
You're absolutely right. New York Cap and Invest has the potential to be a really generational sort of policy framework to support New York's clean energy and climate goals. And it's all oriented around, of course, the goals of the CLCPA Act, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And as you mentioned in the intro, it's being designed by NYSERDA and Department of Environmental Conservation, really two sort of partner agencies. NYSERDA focused on energy transition issues and climate policy broadly, environmental conservation focused on climate policy and environmental protection and emissions regulations. And the program has these two basic parts, the cap and the investment. And the cap refers to an allowance budget that will be set every year and to decline every year between now and 2050 to get to the CLCPA's goal of 85% reductions below 1990 levels in greenhouse gases. The state will issue these allowances, 1 per ton of GHG emissions allowed in the state. They will issue the allowances, they'll sell the allowances, and they'll generate revenue for the state. And the state will use those funds to reinvest in activities that help to reduce emissions in the state.
And give me some perspective here. Where does the Cap and Invest program sit in terms of its rulemaking, process at this point?
They are, I would say, in the back half of the ballgame. Starting in the early part of last year, NYSERDA and DEC kicked off a really significant and sort of multi-part stakeholder engagement, education, outreach, comment period with several rounds of conceptual proposal development to help entities like National Grid really understand what they had in mind and to get input.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they've done is they've issued a couple of these, rounds of draft. I won't call them proposals, but pre-proposal outline, I think was the name of the most recent one. And stakeholders have provided comments. So where they are now is they're sitting with a set of comments that we've most recently submitted, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of other stakeholders across New York. And they're working on the final draft proposal that will be put out for official public rulemaking and then acted upon and issued in the form of final regulations. So there's a bit to it.
Do you have some sense of timing in terms of when you suspect that draft proposal might be released? And even more importantly, when do you think that something like this might actually go into effect and entities such as National Grid might have to start to comply with this?
I would say the state's being very diligent in the outreach that they're doing and the engagement and the analysis that they're doing to try to anticipate the impacts of different program designs and the impact of what their proposed program design will be. So they're going through that process. And I think I would expect draft proposal to be out before the end of the year. Mm-hmm. I know we're still early in 2024, so that's a pretty big time window, but that's I'm anticipating that they're going to act as quickly as they can, to put this forward, get public comment on it, and move toward implementation. 2025 is I think a year that they've identified as beginning of implementation. I couldn't tell you whether that's going to be the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, the end of the year, but that's what they're operating toward, as I understand it today.
All right, so let's understand a little bit more about the structure of the cap and invest. You laid it out in the fact that there's a cap part and an invest part. If the title didn't give that away and spoil it for us, let's break those into those two different pieces and start talking a little bit about the cap part to begin with. All right, what is this going to affect? How is this going to affect? 1 ton of carbon emissions, as you laid out as being an allowance. Who are the entities that are really going to be impacted by the cap part of the cap and invest program?
It's intended to be an economy-wide program. And what that means is that it's intended to be a program that helps reduce emissions across every sector. And 2021 emissions data show about 360 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in New York State. That needs to come down to about 60. So from 360 to 60 from the chart that I'm looking at right now. And that's just, as you can imagine, and as you know, and as your audience knows, the journey that we've set out for ourselves and our policymakers have set out for ourselves. So the way I think about it is that every sector needs to do its part. Now, with a program like this and the incredible breadth and diversity of the economy in New York State, we've got to break it down a little bit. And so the way that they are approaching it is trying to say, we want to cover as many sectors as we possibly can, acknowledging that it may be impractical to impose a compliance requirement on, really small scale operations, for example. One of the examples that they're talking about exempting from the cap is wood burning fireplaces, right?
I was going to ask what the impact could be for like a residential homeowner with a gas appliance or a wood burning fireplace, or,
right.
I'm going to have to worry about my water heater and having to go out and buy an allowance on this.
So I don't think you'll have to buy an allowance, at least not directly for your water heater. But the way that they're focusing on implementation, at least for the energy sector, is by focusing on the fuel supplier, the fuel distributor. And so that is the entity that supplies the commodity of natural gas, of gasoline, of delivered fuel oil, for example, just focusing on the heating sector, right, and gasoline for transportation. And so those are commodities that are used by every type of customer in New York. Notice I didn't say electricity because the agencies are still thinking about how they're going to approach the electric sector. And given the existence of the regional greenhouse gas initiative that has regulated carbon dioxide emissions for quite a while now.
But it is interesting that you talk about the allowances being the entities responsible for the allowances will be the distribution companies, whether it's distribution of gas, whether it's distribution of gasoline, and not necessarily the end consumer. A pickup truck isn't going to have to go out and buy an allowance every time that they fuel up. It's going to be priced into their gas in some form or fashion.
That's right. Now, to be clear, there are large industrial businesses, right, that have sufficiently large emissions profile and sufficiently large, sufficient sophistication to be able to, participate in, an emissions allowance program with a compliance obligation, and to go out into the market to buy these allowances either through a state auction or through trading between entities, outside of the auctions. So they are, working on what the right level of emissions cap is in terms of thousands of tons of emissions per year, to identify where that threshold is.
Got it. And so this is really what all these pre-proposal conversations are about: how to set that, and then also how to entice the appropriate entities to participate, and not unduly burden the individual smaller, people or organizations who may not necessarily have the sophistication or the wherewithal to actually contribute to an auction like that.
Exactly right.
All right. So that's the cap part. Now let's talk about the invest part, because as you talked about, it is going to generate revenue for the state. And that revenue is going to be reinvested into greenhouse gas reduction programs. What do those look like, Karsten? How are they thinking about the invest part of this equation?
It's a really important part of the equation because entities have to take action to reduce emissions. And we know that doesn't come, for free. And Governor Hochul's administration has said that affordability for New Yorkers, and including energy affordability, is an important priority to balance in the design of this program. And so we think choosing where you invest your funds as a state to help bring down the costs of GHG reducing technologies and conversion by customers to lower emitting technologies, that's really important. We don't know, at this stage with a high degree of certainty how funds are likely to be spent. NYSERDA plans to provide annual guidance to the state on where investment priorities should be made, but at this stage they're still working on the details of the compliance obligation, who has to hold an allowance, as well as how the allowance auctions will work. And there's been a little bit less focus on nailing down with a lot of certainty the funding priorities. That being said, what they've indicated so far in their engagement with stakeholders is that they're really focused on buildings and transportation decarbonization, right? And these are probably not surprising priorities given all of the work that's ongoing on building decarb and energy efficiency and electrification, and similarly on the transportation side. So I'd say we've got a high level view of those as important priorities, and within the building space, for example, the entities have said that providing a lot of incentives for limited and low and medium income customers, LMI customers, right, is going to really help improve affordability for customers who have the least ability to afford, higher energy prices as a result of carbon pricing.
It's very likely that this is going to raise costs of something out there. We're transferring revenue into the state from requiring heavy emitters to reduce their greenhouse gases, right? That revenue is being reinvested into opportunities to lower the cost of those actions that those emitters can take, as well as what other entities, such as your low and moderate income or disadvantaged communities, can go through. I wouldn't be surprised to see dollars flow into projects themselves. Whether it's renewable energy projects, maybe an offshore wind project or whatnot, storage, etc. But also through affordability programs, into LMI. It seems like an all of the above type of situation right now as they try to figure out what exactly their invest program is going to look like.
That's right. One of the presentations that your readers might be interested in is a January 2024 presentation by NYSERDA on some of their program analysis. It's called Preliminary Scenario Analyses. And they indicate, some scenarios that they're evaluating and some of the subsectors within building decarbonization and transport decarbonization and their categories that are probably going to be quite familiar to your audiences. I think it's important to also mention that as part of that affordability priority, the New York legislature has actually required that the program used 30% of its revenues to return directly to customers for bill offsets. That's sort of a straight off the top, way of reducing the anticipated impacts of this program on
doing what they can to make certain that any of the cost impact doesn't necessarily flow through to the end consumer. It's really being used for the greenhouse gas reductions.
Yeah, as you said, Paul, that is going to increase costs for customers, and that price signal that customers will have to choose lower emitting technologies is a foundational construct in the program to be sure. But given the pace of emissions reductions that are required, not only to 2050, but between now and 2030 under the climate law, right, are so the pace is so rapid that a program like this is going to rely on a combination of sort of like a carrot and a stick to try and incentivize customer behavior.
I'll include a link to that NYSERDA report in the show notes. And then to your latest point about 2030 and 2050, the CLCPA requires a 40% reduction by 2030 and then a full 85% reduction by 2050. And that's really what the Cap and Invest program is targeting. Broadly speaking, this is a big tool to try to get industry and heavy emitters to move in that direction. All right. So this is what Cap and Invest is. All right. Thank you for laying out the foundation for that. Certainly, we could name it anything that we want, but it sure sounds a lot like a cap and trade program, which has kind of been a political football over the years as we've kind of bounced around how exactly to implement something like that. You've mentioned in the past mentioned earlier in the program about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is RGGI up here in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states, which acts as something of a cap and trade for carbon allowances. How is this different, or how is this similar to how we've traditionally thought about from a cap and trade perspective?
Great question. I think there are some fundamental similarities as you think about what this program is trying to do, economically speaking. Pricing carbon, allowing for the trading of allowance permits between compliance entities in order to try and achieve the least cost overall economy-wide emissions reductions. And that's something that we, at National Grid have supported, going all the way back to federal Waxman-Markey legislation, right? But as you note, it's been a rocky road for these sorts of programs, politically speaking. So RGGI is broadly seen amongst stakeholders as having been a successful program in helping to bring down emissions in the Northeast from the power sector. All indications are that New York, would like to try to remain within RGGI and to keep RGGI intact. From what I understand,
Are these two programs complementary to each other, or is there a little bit of a conflict in terms of having your own cap and invest program and be part of RGGI?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons the agencies have stopped short of saying at this point exactly where to go on this, because they're wrestling with that question. And there are only a couple of options. One would be to fully exempt electric generators from New York's cap and invest program and allow that sector to be covered by RGGI.
Mm.
The other option would be to try to make them compatible in some way with one another. For example, by requiring entities to comply with both, but giving those electric generators, some sort of initial credit based on the allowance value of a RGGI allowance, and then having them pay the difference or hold enough allowances sort of for to recognize that difference in value. So it's complicated, to be sure, and I guess I'll add another wrinkle for the electric generating sector, and that's the fact that the CLCPA itself has a statutory requirement for clean electricity, which is 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. And so with a clear statutory requirement like that is also being implemented through large scale procurements of renewable capacity by NYSERDA, the electricity sector is already on a path toward decarbonization, and there are good questions being evaluated as to, well, would a carbon price make an impact on these things that are already happening outside of the market.
So RGGI, for the audience's sake, it's a cooperative membership program. It involves the northeastern states primarily. There was a series of court cases in Pennsylvania recently at the end of last year around Pennsylvania's involvement in RGGI. They are a member state to RGGI, but they don't actually administer RGGI in the state. And there was some question as to whether that cap and trade program would actually be appropriate for Pennsylvania. And the courts came down and said, no, this is actually a tax. And so you can't, through executive action, take activity here and apply RGGI. It needs to be legislated. That implies to me that there's going to be some concerns around the cap and invest program at New York as well. Is the cap and invest program a legislated activity, or is it something that Governor Hochul is trying to implement through executive action? And how are they thinking about some of these questions that Pennsylvania and RGGI have already kind of teed up for us?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll start by saying that I'm not a lawyer, so no one should depend upon this for any sort of legal advice for how they should act one way or another. But every indication is that the Hochul administration believes it has the authority to implement this program without enabling legislation. And they've been, I think, operating under that understanding for more than a year now. The legislature, I mentioned earlier, a statutory requirement on the program to, with regard to the revenue allocation.
Mm-hmm.
And, so far we've seen from the legislature, kind of indication that maybe they think all they, need to be concerned with is setting up some guardrails on how the money is used. That being said, one probably could imagine legal challenges of exactly the nature that you've described as this program gets closer toward implementation.
It's tough to see this future playing out without some sort of legal challenge around it. But at least in terms of the research that I've done on this, it does feel or at least NYSERDA and the DOEC, have really discussed about how the CLCPA, that climate act that you talked about earlier, gives them the authority to do something. And this cap and invest program is there something in order to meet the requirements from that piece of legislation. So in a certain sense, it has been legislated. Now give us the authority to go out and actually execute against it.
I think that's right. And I think you can also look to programs in California and Washington that have, as I understand it, survived legal challenge to, to be implemented with a very similar sort of structure as what New York is proposing to do.
Let's shift a little bit and talk about how National Grid is responding to this. Obviously, you're a huge entity in the state. You have both the electricity side and the generating side of the equation, as well as gas distribution. You're going to be affected by this. How's National Grid thinking about this, and how does this fit within your own energy transition and clean energy plan?
Thanks for that question. It's a really important one that we've been thinking through and spending some time analyzing. And, I'll start by saying that National Grid believes that economy-wide, market-based emissions reduction programs like this are the right way to move forward with climate policy, and that this program could serve as a really foundational construct to help move along emissions reductions under the CLCPA. It's not the only policy, right, that exists or that is going to be needed. There are a whole family of other programs and policies that sometimes are called complementary policies. And those are also really important to think about and to plan for and understand how they interact. But foundationally, pricing GHG emissions is the economically rational way to try and address that externality and incorporate that externality into the economy. Our operations have a couple of different dimensions, as you said. Electricity transmission and distribution in upstate New York with the Niagara Mohawk Power Company. Gas distribution, both in upstate as part of the Niagara Mohawk Company and downstate as part of the Keyspan companies serving Long Island and Brooklyn and Staten Island. And those areas, those are our distribution companies. In addition, National Grid has some thermal generation units on Long Island that we operate on long-term contract to LIPA, Long Island Power Authority. And National Grid also has ownership in renewable generation facilities that are in development, including offshore wind resources and some related non-regulated transmission. So we've got a big portfolio of companies, and we're working through how a cap and invest program could impact that portfolio. And I think we're coming up to just sort of with a couple of conclusions so far, and that we've shared with stakeholders and with the agencies, and that is, as I said, it's a good construct. It should move forward, and agencies need to be mindful of the costs on customers, and that's because, as we talked about, there's going to be a cost, and energy customers in New York, especially in the downstate regions, but also many types of customers in upstate New York are energy price sensitive. The program needs to recognize and to really anticipate what those costs are going to be, and take necessary measures to try to mitigate those costs as much as possible and support customers in pursuing the conversions of their home and business equipment to reduce their emissions and reduce their compliance obligations under the program. So those two go hand in hand. Establish the program and really determine how you're going to support customers through the transition so that this program works for everybody.
In addition to those cap compliance concerns that you raised earlier, as well as some of the affordability concerns, is there any role that National Grid plays in the invest side of the equation? as we start talking about investing in renewable or distributed assets or affordability programs, like how's National Grid thinking about that side of the equation?
I think it's a really important part of the equation as well. And you know, if you look at just the building and the transportation sectors that have been sort of some of the focus of analysis so far from the agencies, we have a critical role to play. And starting on the transportation side, um, EV charging infrastructure is one of the most important levers to continue growing the market for EV adoption, both at the consumer level and perhaps even more importantly at the medium and heavy duty trucking and fleet segment, and public transit electrification as well. And so we've got existing programs that are funded by electric ratepayers, electric customers, to develop that charging infrastructure and partner with charging host sites to do that. And whatever activities in this area that NYSERDA funds, using cap and invest revenues in the future need to really sort of go hand in glove with some of the programs that we already operate, as well as of course the federal incentive dollars that are flowing in and be supporting development for transport charging. On the building side, National Grid and other New York utilities, administer energy efficiency and electrification programs in partnership with NYSERDA, in concert with NYSERDA in some segments. And so that also needs to be sort of carefully coordinated and planned for in terms of how revenues will flow through and how customers will experience these program offerings in a way that really makes it easy for them to participate. So those are a couple of instances for the buildings and transport. I think we're also interested in seeing NYSERDA further consider other ways for using the revenue to support continued decarbonization of the supply of electricity and gas, and that's there are a lot of programs already being funded by electric customers through electric rates for the NYSERDA procurements of renewable electricity, and we think attention also needs to be paid to the opportunities to reduce emissions intensity in natural gas through renewable natural gas development and production and blending. Right, it's a great resource for reducing methane emissions from a whole host of waste sectors that can be really difficult to abate otherwise, and potentially also the production of renewable hydrogen that could be blended in some quantities, into the gas network over time to help reduce that emissions intensity for buildings and other end uses that are going to be difficult to electrify.
And I'll actually turn my audience to a couple of the previous episodes that I've done around renewable natural gas and hydrogen. If anybody wants additional information around how those industries are growing. Karsten, as we start to get towards the end of this conversation, and my New York audience specifically, how should New York constituents be thinking about this and raising their voice to participate in this conversation?
Yeah, I love that question because it all comes down to the consumer and the voter, right? Programs like this need the public to support them if they're going to be established and to endure. And customers need to not be surprised that programs like this are coming and are designed really to help them make choices that are a little bit different than the choices that they make today. So I think knowing that the program is coming, understanding how they would expect to see prices increase for some of the ways that they use energy and potentially other sort of climate intensive activities in their life, but also to recognize that the agencies are being really thoughtful about what the right level of price signal is, and that also that really probably should vary based on what alternatives are available to customers, and so it's got to be understood as one tool in the toolkit that helps to nudge customers toward decarbonized alternatives.
Karsten, last question. As we wrap up, what are the 3 or 4 things that you want to make certain the audience takes away from this talk today?
I think number one, New York's got aggressive climate goals. Agencies, industry, consumer groups are working together to try to address those in a way that is affordable and reliable. And that's going to need continued collaboration and knowledge sharing and partnership and shared strategies. Number two, the agencies working on Cap and Invest are being diligent in their analysis and their development of this program, trying to recognize there's a lot of uncertainty that's still out there in the world about what exact decarbonization strategies in which sectors are going to work, how fast renewable energy, electricity, offshore wind are going to come on. A lot of that depends on really critical investments in electric network upgrades that we're just getting started with, and that's a really key priority. And then finally, that agencies are interested in consumers' perspectives and customers' perspectives, so that when they do come out with a program proposal, it's something that has broad public support.
Well, fantastic. 85% reductions by 2050, enshrined into law through the CLCPA. Cap and Invest, major tool that is going to help to ratchet down the emissions over the course of the next decade and a half or so. Wait, 2.5 decades. As I said in my intro, I'm not as great on the math as I wish I was. Fantastic overview of this. Karsten, thank you very much for coming on the program today and discussing National Grid's perspective in terms of how to move this forward. We really should touch base in a little while, maybe early part of 2025 or so, as some of these proposals get to a completion stage, and we can check back in on the progress of the Cap and Invest program in New York.
I'd love to do that. Thanks for having me.
Karsten, thank you much.